Okay, thanks everybody for coming and everybody online. I'm really excited to introduce Jacob Graham, who's giving our second member series talk of the term, and also very graciously stepped in to fill in a open spot. So thanks a lot, Jacob. Jacob recently graduated from the master's program in economics at UBC. And he's going to be giving a talk on the impacts of COVID-19, work from home policies on labor market outcomes. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Jacob.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Steve. Really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. Thank you, everyone who's online for joining. I really appreciate it. Just before I kick things off, I'd like to do a quick land acknowledgement and say that we're gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. Without any further ado, like Steve was saying, my name is Jacob Graham. I recently graduated from the master's program here at UBC with a degree in economics. I'm now a behavioral science fellow at the Privy Council office at the Impact and Innovation Unit, where I try to bring behavioral economics into environmental spaces. And today I'm going to be talking about the impacts of COVID-19 work from home policies on labor market outcomes, on differential labor market outcomes. So without any further ado, I might as well kick it off. Just to give us an idea of how today's going to look, I'll present a quick roadmap. So first of all, I'll be talking about the motivation behind why I chose this topic. It's obviously very present in the dialect that we hear today, in the news cycles, and even in academia, we hear about how remote work is potentially the new normal. Most recently, we've seen new variants of COVID-19 hit the country and the world at large, and now we've had to move to online scenarios again. The problems that I've isolated from this and the problems that I'm looking to solve, and then how I aim to solve them with my empirical strategy. And then from there, I'll present any results that I would have found, and then what kind of considerations for the future that would look like. So again, this was my master's work that I did when I was here at UBC, and let's kick it off. So first of all, the motivation. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen many firms in countless industries transition to remote work. So 35.2% of the US workforce worked entirely from home in May of 2020. This is actually an 82% increase from February of the same year. So within the span of a few months, we've seen an 82% increase in workforce working online or working remotely. Secondly, 71.7% of workers that could work from home indeed did so in May of 2020. And just a quick note, I'll be using remote work from home, and the acronym WFH to mean the exact same thing, which is remote work or working from home outside of an office. Next here we have that work from home now accounts for over 60% of US economic activity. And again, these are StatsCan numbers. The first two are from a study in 2020. 32% of Canadian employees worked from home in the beginning of 2021, and 3.1 million Canadians were working from home temporarily by February of 2021. So again, absolutely kind of a huge shift in how work is done has happened over the past 2.5, almost 3 years now. As we begin to transition back to normalcy, it's going to be of great interest for us to investigate this shift and see how working from home will and how it ought to become part of Canadian work culture going forward and global work culture as kind of a whole. Firms and governments alike are going to find it prudent to analyze this as we start to transition out of the economy. So I'll add a little caveat here as well. While this does provide us with an opportune environment to analyze exogenous labor market shocks or kind of a shock to the system that we know exists, what we need to keep in the back of our minds is the human aspect of this, and this is a pandemic we're talking about. So this is obviously brought on unprecedented, as much as we hate to hear the word, unprecedented loss of life. So it's something that we need to consider, that we're not just looking at numbers here. This is a pandemic. This has brought on disaster for a lot of people. So while this is interesting from an academic standpoint, a really kind of interesting thing to study, we need to remember this as we go forward. The question that I ultimately want to answer for you folks here, or at least illuminate a little bit, is in a post-pandemic world, what does work look like? So continuing with the motivation here, I'd like to introduce you to a fellow named Nicholas Bloom, who's from Stanford. And he's done research on working from home that dates back all the way to 2015, so pre-pandemic times, which seems like a totally different time, probably a distant memory for a lot of us. But his work involved, it involved Chinese travel agency C-Trip and the employees that were working at the call center in the hotel and airfare industry side of things. So essentially what he did, a quick overview of his experiment, kind of his experiment that paved the way for a lot of work from home experimentation going forward. There were 996 call center employees that were surveyed on whether they would like to work from home 4 out of 5 days per week. So again, this is a bit of a hybrid system. It's not complete work from home because these employees would be at the office 1 day out of those 5. 503 employees were interested in working from home, so about half. And then these ones, so anytime we get, like as a lot of us here know, we're academics, we know that anytime we allow people to self-select, we're going to observe biases more likely than not. So we have to be cognizant of that. The employees that self-selected into this I'd like to work from home experimental status, they tended to demonstrate lower levels of education and tenure. They owned their own home and faced significantly longer work commutes. So again, just kind of the biases we see in that self-selection process. 249 of the participants qualified. So again, about a quarter of the total that were surveyed and about half that were interested qualified to work from home. And then the workers were assigned based on birth date, whether or not they would be working from home or working from the office. And then all other potential confounding variables were controlled for. So that included managers, team members, everyone. So the hardware that they had at home was the same as what was in the office, the incentive and pay structure, as well as the workload distribution. So all of these things were controlled. So again, just to give you a summary of this experiment, it was a Chinese call center, outbound calls based on hotels and airfare, and the company proposed, we're allowing people to work from home. How many of the 900 of you would like to? Half wanted to, a quarter of them got to. These were the results. So we can divide Bloom's results into kind of the individual level and the firm level. So at the individual level, what we noticed from people who were working, what he noticed from people who were working remotely, was that they were 13% more productive. And the productivity here is measured in more outbound calls per shift, but also more minutes worked per shift. So fewer times away from the workstation and fewer breaks taken on their own accord. This, right off the bat, that seems like it could be kind of miserable if I'm working more, but they actually measured and saw that higher worker satisfaction and there were lower attrition rates. So fewer people left the job if they were working from home to find other work, and there were higher levels of worker satisfaction. Moreover, they had higher psychological attitude scores. So based on the metrics that were determined by Nick Bloom and his team, workers that are working from home were doing better psychologically. And lastly here, there were no negative spillover effects. So the negative spillover effects would be, this is what wasn't observed. So we weren't observing, or Nick wasn't observing, I'm calling him like I know him, like I don't know the guy, isn't Dr. Bloom, I guess. He observed the people who wanted to work from home but couldn't, so their birth date wasn't drawn. There might have been negative spillover effects or negative effects saying, well, I wish I could have worked from home while my colleagues are, my psychological scores are going to be lower, my attrition is lower, my work satisfaction is lower. They actually observed none of that. So there were no negative spillover effects. The one negative correlation they saw was there was a negative correlation with career advancement, which we'll talk about in a bit here. You'll notice right off, those of you who can see my slides, I'm not a graphic designer, but I did try to create my own little graphics here. So every now and then you're going to see like a lady with a frowny face or something that's a bit jarring. So I apologize in advance. But yeah, so there was a negative correlation with working from home with career advancement. So individuals who were working from home got fewer promotions, and they were up for fewer promotion opportunities, and their success rates for those promotion opportunities were lower as well. So just fewer opportunities for career advancement, which is an interesting phenomenon for sure. So these were the results at the individual level. At the firm level, we saw a 20 to 30% increase in total factor productivity. Total factor productivity in normal words is just, it's a coefficient that multiplies your whole production function, which isn't normal person terms. It's a coefficient that multiplies how productive your firm is. So 20 to 30% more productive in total factor sense. And moreover, there was about $2,000 like US dollars savings per employee per year, which was from subletting parking spaces that would have been taken up by employees who came in to work from the office, fewer supplies needed to supply at the office itself, such as coffees and those kind of things that employees were taking care of themselves. So yeah, definitely really interesting that there were firm level advantages as well. The firm level advantages were actually so apparent that the firm went back to Bloom and said, we'd like you to do even more research. Instead of randomly selecting who gets to work from home and who doesn't, we'd like to let people select. So whoever wanted to is allowed to, whoever doesn't want to doesn't have to. So when employees were allowed to choose, productivity actually increased 22% instead of the 13% before. So again, giving the individuals that option to select whether they'd like to work from home or not increased the productivity that they saw. So this got me thinking, so obviously these are really interesting statistics. It's interesting because it happened pre-pandemic. I was more interested in what's happening during the pandemic. So we've got, these are nice numbers. Obviously, they're more productive, we're happier, we're having a better time, but we're not looking at it during the pandemic. So I decided to do just kind of like a really broad overview search, like Google searches, and just look through what's the dialogue around working from home during the pandemic. And I actually found a pretty varied response. So I'm throwing up a lot of articles here all at once. Don't worry about reading them all. I'll go over one by one. But what I'm doing is I'm just looking at what are people talking about when it comes to working from home. So we can see in this first one here what bosses really think about remote work. People who work from home get fewer raises and promotions, which is again reflecting what I was talking about and what Bloom found in his experiment. But it might be a way but there might be a way to remove the remote work penalty. So again, kind of a positive outlook on things. A positive outlook in consideration, like considering that we're probably losing promotions and pay when we work from home. Secondly here, working from home post-pandemic could offer mixed results for women, researchers say. Employees are feeling burned over broken work from home promises or corporate culture BS. Burning out, remote workers report paying a price for increased productivity. So again, that alludes to what we were talking about with Bloom. This productivity is higher, but what's the price that we're paying? And these articles are all taken from the pandemic. Will Canadians ditch the office? Many want to keep working from home after the pandemic. So this is kind of an alternative look at things. Every article that we've looked at so far, at least in the headline, is kind of outlining a negative about working from home. And we see someone talking about a positive. And I included this last guy here just because I got a kick out of it. So you'll notice that every article that I've outlined so far, we have someone with a typically female name or someone who's female presenting saying something that's probably negative about working from home. And then we have this guy with the typically, male presenting face with a typical male name who's saying, studies show people are working from home or having sex, dating, taking naps, and doing side hustles. So obviously there's a difference in how people are experiencing this work from home phenomenon. Not everybody's experiencing it the same way. And I wanted to get to the bottom of that, and I was interested in what those differences were. So furthermore, the motivation, as I kind of alluded to, I want to bring it into the Canadian context, and I want to understand what the dynamic between different sexes is for working from home, and that was kind of what I'm interested in, especially during COVID-19, because nothing had kind of been done so far for that. The prevalent dialogue around remote work during the pandemic varied greatly across individuals. Some cited more time with family and more control over the schedule as a benefit, such as this gentleman here. Whereas others believe that remote work has been a burden to work-life balance and productivity, such as this gentleman here. So I'm sure, as students and as people who are working remote right now, within UBC, we're experiencing a lot of maybe the second image here. Maybe some of us are experiencing the first, but it varies greatly across individuals, right? All right, so just touching base again, we're going to look at the problems I wanted to solve. So now we've got the motivation for what I wanted to do. I wanted to take a look at, we have these statistics about working from home, but how do we contextualize them within the Canadian context? How do we bring them into the COVID-19 context as well? And what are the differential impacts? Let's look at cross sections of that productivity increase. How did it influence different people different ways? So essentially, I wanted to answer, how did COVID-19 work from home policies impact Canadian workers? I wanted to answer which socio-economic and demographic factors determine the impact that working from home has had on Canadian workers. And lastly, so based on those results, to what extent should firms and governments remain invested in work from home measures going forward? I essentially wanted to say, is it fair to say that work from home is universally beneficial? Is that an okay thing to say? And obviously it sounds like kind of a stupid assumption, and it will depend. But that's kind of the answer that I wanted to seek out. So question one that I was asking, does the impact on labor market outcomes of COVID-19 work from home policies vary between sexes? So automatically when we think of working from home, especially in the context of the pandemic, children were sent home from schools and preschools, and more people were working from home who had other people in the house with them at the same time. Responsibilities started to shift. I wanted to understand, are childcare responsibilities and housework roles split unevenly between romantic partners? Moreover, I wanted to look at, is caring for children and others indicated? So caring for children and others was indicated as a top 3 barrier to labor productivity, and this is from the labor force survey in February of 2021. As we can see, kind of the third bar there, needing to do, caring for children or other family members as a huge burden to productivity, including with that, lack of interaction with coworkers and other stuff. But clearly there's something going on with the coincidence of students coming home from school and us having to work from home and trying to be productive at the same time. So moving on, there was a second question I wanted to look at as well. Were individuals in multifamily dwellings adversely affected by working from home during the COVID-19 pandemic in Canada? So labor market outcomes are likely positively correlated to having your own space to work, and as students we can kind of, I'm sure, corroborate that. When we think about having to share space with others, productivity can take a hit big time. It can be nice to study and work with other people in certain scenarios, but how much of that is lost when we're forced to collaborate when we don't need to, or maybe there's excess noise and that kind of stuff. Only 49% of respondents to another Bloom study have the ability to work privately in a room other than their bedroom. So again, this is clearly kind of an issue, and if we're looking at cross sections of the labor force participation market, those who can't afford to have their own place to work are going to be negatively discriminated against when we consider work from home policies going forward. So we've outlined the motivation for why it is that I want to take a look at behavioral motivations for working from home and labor force participation. Now we're looking at, we looked at the problems that I wanted to isolate to solve, and lastly we want to look at the empirical strategy here. Next we want to look at the empirical strategy here. So the labor force participation variable that I was interested in here was unpaid overtime hours. So this is defined on StatsCan's website as time spent directly on work or work-related activities over and above scheduled pay hours, and these must be extra hours worked for which the respondent received no additional compensation. So I use this labor force participation variable of unpaid overtime hours as a proxy or an instrument for work-life balance, which again I'm happy to have a conversation about that. But if we look at neoclassical economic labor theory, the concept of having a $0 compensated hour of labor is one that points itself towards, something's going on here, and chances are it's not if you believe that economic agents have their own agency, chances are that this is a decrease in utility or work-life balance. So the data I have are divided into 2 groups: those who cannot work from home, individuals who did not work remotely during the pandemic, and then who did work from home, individuals who did transition to remote work during the pandemic. So these are individuals who didn't work from home before the pandemic and now do. So I wasn't as much interested in the ones who, I still analyzed it, but I wasn't as much interested in those who didn't work remotely before and didn't work remotely after. I wasn't so much interested in those who did work remotely before and did work remotely after. I'm interested in the ones where the pandemic forced them to work remotely. And then the data set I used was the StatsCan labor force surveys from 2019 and 2020. Obviously, 2021 data is available now, so it's very easy to update this data set and look at how the results would lie. It's monthly data on labor market activities in Canada's working age population. And we had about a million and two variables for each set observations for each set with about 60 variables. I will kind of give a warning. So I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty equations, the math, the empirical strategy, or anything like that. I'm going to keep everything at a very high level. However, I have included in the appendix my equations, my econometric strategy. So I'm happy to go through those if you'd like. But for those of you who are really interested in math, I'm sorry, you might have to wait till the end. And for those of you who don't like math at all, then you're welcome. So the empirical strategy, I used what's called a triple differencing approach. So I ran an ordinary least squares regression equation, and I used a difference in difference approach, and then I differenced it. So I did a triple differencing regression equation. The objective was to construct a series of equations that allowed the isolation of the following effects. So I'm going to pause here. Remember what I said about my propensity to be graphically designing impaired? So I did my best. It's not bad. But essentially, this is what the equations that I was designing were hoping to outline. And I'll let everybody kind of take a look at this. We have this variable of interest on the right-hand side, unpaid overtime hours. I don't know if you can see no, you can't. That's fine. Unpaid overtime hours. On the left-hand side, we have this kind of exogenous labor market shock. We have the COVID-19 pandemic forcing people to work from home. There's three channels or three lenses that this is going to be impacting unpaid overtime hours. Well, at least that I was interested in. Obviously, there's all sorts of different lenses that are available, but the ones that I had isolated are multifamily dwellings, whether or not someone lives in a multifamily dwelling, the sex, the biological sex of the respondent, and just the direct effect of the COVID-19 work from home policies on unpaid overtime hours. So what I have marked as number one here is that effect that COVID working from home, COVID policies have on unpaid overtime hours through that lens or through that channel of multifamily dwelling. So the overall effect of that top channel is how much is unpaid overtime hours changing just when we run the correlation between multifamily dwelling and unpaid overtime hours. That then branches off and we see this sort of differential approach, and we can measure kind of the differential effect during the pandemic of how that changed. We've got this direct effect of overall, like the number two that I've denoted here is number two. COVID-19 work from home policies, how did they implement or how did they impact unpaid overtime hours just in general? And lastly, this effect of biological sex. So was there, the effect that COVID-19 work from home policies had on unpaid overtime hours through the lens of biological sex? So yeah, this is kind of the series of, or the sequence of equations that I created helped me isolate these effects that, again, are in the appendix we can look at if people are interested in. So this is the empirical strategy that I employed. And now we can take a look at the results and what my findings were. So prior to actually running the regressions themselves, I did kind of a pre-analysis summary. So I looked at some of the findings that the data was just presenting. These should be taken with a grain of salt, obviously, because we have data, like we have the actual sample sizes changing year over year. And the other thing to consider is this is quasi-panel data. It's not a perfect longitudinal study. So in other words, we're not looking at the exact same individuals year over year. It's fine. We can still do the same, we can still do similar kind of result. We can still drive similar results from quasi-panel data. You can still run regressions just as well. But we need to remember that we're not observing the exact same people year over year. So pre-COVID, the average unpaid overtime hours per week was actually lower than during COVID. That's kind of, it makes sense to me at least. It confirms my hypothesis that we have, at least to some extent, people working harder and not being compensated for it. This could be perhaps in healthcare fields, education fields. That's immediately what I thought of. When we break it down by biological sex, we see that So again, remember, we have this average increase in unpaid overtime hours per week. This is for people who had less or greater than 0 unpaid overtime hours in 1 week. When we move to this breakdown by sex, it goes down for males, but for females we see an increase. So the increase itself again, it might tell us a bit about what kind of field people are working in and the fields that different people are self-selecting into and how many unpaid overtime hours per week that they're facing during the pandemic. But we can see, so overall we had an increase in the unpaid overtime hours per week. That was carried largely by the increase in unpaid overtime hours per week that women were working. And then the results, so after running the regression, I came up with kind of 4.5 results. One of them is not a real result, it's just the lack of a result, which I'm taking credit as a result. The first one is workers in industries that can participate in remote work tend to report more unpaid overtime hours in general, regardless of the pandemic status. So I'll let you kind of look at that pretty closely. This is 1.15 hours per week, roughly. So people who have the capacity to work from home in those industries, so I classified industries as either being able to work from home or not. People who are able to work from home, those industries tend to have a higher level of unpaid overtime hour works. Or reported, rather. So another important thing to remember is this is a labor force participation survey. It's not a direct measure of work, it's self-reported hours. So there might be some measurement problems there too. So that's essentially the first finding that I found. When we control for the type of work that they're doing, the demographics, seasonality, and provincial controls, these remain statistically significant at 99.9%. But I'm not exactly proud of that because my sample size is ginormous and asymptotics and law of large numbers are just going crazy at that point. So, result number 2, for those who can work remotely, doing so during the pandemic actually resulted in fewer unpaid overtime hours reported. This was a big surprise to me. I wasn't expecting this. Again, when we control for those same controls as before, this remains significant at the 99.9% level. The magnitude of this change isn't huge. It's about 0.08 hours per week. But still, those who can work remotely and did so during the pandemic, so those who had that shift during the pandemic said, okay, now we're moving you to online, you're doing remote work during the pandemic, reported fewer unpaid overtime hours worked. So to me, that was a very interesting result. Our third result here, being a parent has small but positive effect on unpaid overtime hours reported. Those who have children and worked remotely during the pandemic reported more unpaid overtime hours than others. So let's pause and kind of break this down a little bit. So being a parent has a small but positive effect. So that was about 0.2 hours per week. Again, I say small, it's relatively small, but if you're the one working an extra 15 minutes per week, that's unpaid, like that adds up, right? So again, I'm saying small, but that's relative to the other effects. It's a small but positive effect on unpaid overtime hours worked. So those who have children and worked remotely during the pandemic worked more unpaid overtime hours than others. So this is where I kind of draw a lot of that comparison between unpaid overtime hours worked and work-life balance. So if you have your kids at home, when you're trying to work, it may be that you're taking on more responsibilities than you did before. Perhaps you have to take your kids somewhere. Perhaps you have to prep lunch for them. You have to get them started on an assignment, or now you're teaching them all of a sudden, and you're not able to do the same amount of work within your working hours that you were before. So you've had to add another 15 minutes on to the end of your day, or maybe you took 15 minutes out of your lunch break. This is the result that made the most sense to me, in my opinion. Number of hours spent away from work due to family responsibilities has positive predictive power on the amount of uncompensated extra work you do. So again, this makes sense. If you had to take care of family, if you had to take care of children, it makes sense that you would be working more unpaid overtime hours because you had to fill in those gaps. And then the number of hours spent away. So essentially for every child that you had, you worked an extra 0.2 hours per week during the pandemic if you were working from home. Or like unpaid overtime hours, and that was what you reported. For the second one, for every hour you spent away from your computer working on family stuff, or that took you away from work, you had to work on family or children, like child-related stuff, it was reported as 0.1, or I guess 0.9 hours worked that were uncompensated. So. The fourth result here, working from home during the pandemic had a negative effect on unpaid overtime hours reported for workers regardless of sex, this effect was stronger in women. So this is that difference in difference approach kind of kicking in. So again, when we control for demographics, work, seasonality, like provincial stuff, this is significant, not at 99.9, but 95%. So again, just because we have such a massive data set. This effect was 0.06. So again, not huge, and when we're talking about magnitude, but it definitely was significantly positively or negatively correlated. So what does this mean? If we were to put this in layman terms, and if we're interpreting it with the understanding that unpaid overtime hours are a decent, at least, instrument for work-life balance, is that work-life balance for people who were able to work at home during the pandemic, when we control for everything else, work-life balance actually improved, and it improved more for women than it did for men. And then the last kind of 0.5 takeaway that I have here is that the multifamily dwellings, so living in multifamily dwellings while working from home during the pandemic had virtually no effect on unpaid overtime hours. So this may go against what we saw earlier, but in fact it illuminates that it might not be a predictive, I didn't find that it was a predictor of unpaid overtime hours in general. And this, it was not significant at 95% level or anything like that. And the magnitude of this coefficient was like 0.001. Future considerations, and then we'll wrap up here. So the first question, so it leaves a lot of questions unanswered about the future of work, and it leaves us with a lot of kind of, where do we go from here? You know, we've understood kind of what work from home looks like, and if we've taken a cross section and another cross section and a third cross section of it, and what do we do with the results here? So first of all, is there within pandemic variation? So the increases that people are seeing to their work-life balance and the benefits that they're seeing to their work-life balance, did they start at the beginning of the pandemic and then got worse as time went on? Maybe at the outset of the pandemic, they didn't have much work-life balance, and as the pandemic matured, they were able to adjust their abilities to work from home. Maybe they were invested in infrastructure at their house. They maybe got a better desk or something like that. I actually looked at this and I ran another equation looking at within pandemic variation. I left it out of the analysis because I was going cross-eyed and I couldn't keep track of how many differencing methods that I've done. Well, we found that individuals surveyed during early pandemic gave the most benefit to work-life balance. So right off the bat, people were finding benefits to work-life balance at the outset of the pandemic. That stayed beneficial throughout the pandemic up until late 2021 or mid 2021, but it wasn't as strong as the pandemic matured as it was right off the bat. So my prediction or my hypothesis is that people right at the outset of the pandemic had all these benefits of the novelty of working from home. They were excited about it. And then as the pandemic raged on, the novelty of it wore off and the reality set in. Next, is unpaid overtime hours truly an appropriate proxy for work-life balance? I like to think it is. It may not be. I'm happy again to discuss this. I have a slide in the appendix to talk about neoclassical labor economics and how I think it would be an accurate description. But again, this is up for debate too. Thirdly, are we properly compensating those who cannot work from home? So we saw that there's an increase in unpaid overtime hours worked on average over the pandemic, but we're seeing that people who are working from home are better off with work-life balance. So there's an industry or a subset of industries that are bearing the brunt of this decrease in work-life balance. And my estimation, it's that and a lot of the literature is pointing towards it being nurses and teachers, and frontline workers. Are we accurately and appropriately compensating them for the amount of work that they're putting in and for this loss of work-life balance that they're experiencing? Who is the research missing? So this is this is a very, very specific data set that I looked at. There's those who were laid off during the pandemic that this research completely fails to acknowledge, right? Those who lost their jobs or those who decided to take on the role of the primary caregiver, which in and of itself is it's work, and that is a job, but it's not measured the same way as a paid salaried or hourly career would be, according to Stats Canada. So this is diagnostics and research, and that's obviously worthwhile looking into. How do we rectify the issue of the differences in promotion rates? So again, we alluded to it at the beginning of the presentation. People aren't getting compensated as much when they work from home. If we're working towards a post-pandemic economy that encourages work from home, how do we rectify this issue? If empowering workers and helping them move towards a situation where they control a lot of their work environment is what we're wanting to do to try to promote equality in the workforce, are we creating a different subset of workers that are considered second-class workers by doing that, by allowing or even encouraging people to work from home? Are we isolating a different subset of workers? We need to keep this in consideration as well. What are the implications for housing markets? Housing prices going up or down? Do we need to be searching for, as workers start to work from home, they need to focus on places that have separate areas for them to work that are away from the rest of their family, right? What does the housing markets look like from them? And then more so, what about city structures, right? The Western city is based off of this idea of living in a suburban setting and then going into a corporate head office or something like that. As we, get 20, 30, 50, 100 years down the road and work from home begins to be the new normal, how does the city structure change? Does it change at all? How do we look at, sky rises differently? Do vehicle sales change? People don't need to transport as much into kind of central areas. Are people using methods of transport that they maybe hadn't in the past? Maybe people are using subways or buses or stuff like that. So how does vehicle sales change? And then we can piggyback off of that and look at environmental concerns. As fewer people are driving, there's fewer emissions and less exhaust, but we're using more electricity at home. Right, we're using 3 and 4 monitors in some cases. We're using more computers than we had before, and we're spending a lot more time at home. So this isn't to mention any of the psychological effects and so much more that we could be studying from here. Wrapping up, I'm just going to remind you of Nicholas Bloom. I mean, how could you forget him? I brought him up about 20,000 times. Remember that he outlined that it was mostly positive outcomes from working from home. Remember that it was higher productivity, better job satisfaction, and more profit for companies. However, it's not all rainbows and roses. A follow-up study indicated that 2/3 of the employees that self-selected into that work from home had requested to go back to the office 2 years after this experiment, basically erasing everything that Nick had done. I don't know why I called him Nick. Dr. Bloom had done. Right? So in the face of all of these benefits, 2 years after, everyone, not everyone, but 2/3 of everybody wanted to go back home to the way things were before. So even if, myself and other economists throughout the world study this work from home change, and we find it to be beneficial, and we find it to be, at least empirically sound and a better thing for the economy, do people even want to? Does any of it matter? I asked myself that question a lot as I was doing this research. Does any of this even matter? But yeah, as you can see, there's plenty of work yet to be done. And here's Nick again. The key takeaways, at least this from a personal recommendation standpoint, you should take this obviously with a grain of salt. In my opinion, from the research I've done and from what I've looked at from the vast amount of people that I've interviewed, is remote work should be optional. And that's both at an individual level and at a firm level. So we shouldn't be mandating firms to force people to work from home. We shouldn't be mandating employees to be forced to work from home. And then remote work should be flexible. So you shouldn't have to sign into either 100% off remote, 100% in person. A hybrid system is most advantageous and something that can change. And then this article, this headline of this article, it was sent to me about 6 hours ago. So it just shows how prevalent and important this issue is. We're constantly working on, the new things are coming out about remote work all the time, and the federal public service leaves work from home decision up to departments. So it seems to me at least that in this case, people are headed in the right direction. So thank you so much. I'd like to acknowledge real quick Tamal Lemieux, my supervisor through all this, and my colleague Jordan Barch, who proofread about 20 different versions of this. So yeah, thank you guys so much. Open for questions.
Thank you. That was fantastic.
Thanks.
So we have this new microphone that we're going to test out for the people online. So if anybody here has questions for Jacob, I'll just pass you the mic. And then Aditi is going to be monitoring the chat online. So yeah, any questions?
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that talk.
Thanks.
I was wondering about you went over it a little bit, but well, one, where the data's from, and then two, the methodology to get $0 compensation hours. Is that just reported hours minus the what should be the aggregate hourly wage?
Yeah, so excellent question. The data source, I'll pull it up again here, is the labor force participation survey that StatsCan puts out.
Okay.
And there's actually a section in the survey of saying, like, filling out the amount of like unpaid overtime hours that you worked. So this is a direct question.
Oh, so
directly
people self-reported that?
People self-reported.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it. Cool.
Yeah. In terms of determining, so again, like I can go over it if you'd like, but we have kind of neoclassical labor economic theory determining what a $0 wage would mean. And it essentially means that an economic agent wouldn't be acting rationally. So chances are they would be pulling from a utility function and their work-life balance would be suffering. Does this kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's an excellent question.
Hey Jacob, great
Hey.
talk. Thank you so much for
Thanks.
sharing your findings. Very, very important work, by the way, as well. So thank you for that. I was wondering what is overtime? So is it usually when I went into the office, I would punch out at 5, but when I'm at home, for some reason, I had to work till 5:15, or is it I'm paid for 7 hours of work, and at home I ended up working 7:15 because of some sort of reason?
Yeah, so it's defined by StatsCan, which is the definition that I use, as work that's over and above your scheduled work that you are compensated for. So it's a pretty normal, basic, plain definition, but it's just work that goes above and beyond. So the way it was proposed to the people who reported to the survey was, did you work above and beyond your regularly scheduled hours? Where you compensated for it, fill in how many hours here, and then if you were not compensated for any, those would be the unpaid overtime hours.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey Jacob,
Hey Riku.
that's amazing. Thank you so much for the talk. So I have a question about the data source. So I think it's a statistical data probably done by this government organization. I don't know. I was wondering about like who did the survey and who did not. Like, especially people in medical sectors, they might be too busy.
Yeah.
They might not have enough time to, fill out that really, complicated survey. Or perhaps people might have strong opinions, so they might want to do that. Or, I don't know, you were talking about, the fact that this data does not reflect the people who were laid off. But is there any other consideration about what kind of people from which sector did the survey and who did not? And is there any research about it?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question again, because it has huge implications for how we interpret the results. And I have a few different kind of points to highlight. So the first one is, so the research is done by Stats Canada, and Stats Canada has a mandate that they want to get as accurate as they can in terms of a representation of the Canadian populace. I don't have the descriptive statistics here for the data sets. I could pull them up very easily when we get back maybe, but it's generally as even as it can be. So they do survey people who don't work or had lost their jobs. This wasn't something I was interested in for my analysis. I wanted to isolate the impact of people who were working prior to the pandemic and during the pandemic and worked from home, what those impacts were. So I cleaned those out of my data set myself. But the labor force participation survey includes information on who's been fired and for what reasons, and if it's temporary or permanent. Like I said, there's kind of 60 different variables of interest, so that's all kind of included in that. But yeah, I would say, and then the second thing I would say is that If it's a representation issue, luckily it's about 1/30th of the Canadian population that we have in the survey, right? We have about 1.2 million data points. So once you get that large, it starts to be easier to be a representative survey. And these surveys have been going on for I forget when they started, but you can find data all the way back to the 90s. So hopefully their methodology by now is sound. But yeah, I can totally follow up if you'd like more information about representativeness.
Wonderful, thank you.
No problem.
So great job, Jacob. That was really fun, actually.
Oh, thanks.
So I just had a question about your proxy, right? The
Yeah.
idea is using unpaid overtime
Yeah.
as a proxy for work-life balance.
Yeah.
But aren't the results you find also sort of understandable if we don't interpret an increase in unpaid overtime as a decline in work-life balance so much as it is a decline in efficiency? And I think this might be important in reference to the Bloom study earlier, because it seems like you could interpret Bloom's results as the benefit of working from home, sort of like an efficiency wage, right? You
Yeah.
give people an additional benefit to sort of select out the more efficient workers that might go off to another job or another industry, right? You compensate them more with this benefit, and so they stay, and they end up producing more.
Yep.
But in this case, right, it could be that we see increases in unpaid overtime, not because of anything else other than people aren't working as well as they were before. So there might be two sources of variation, right? There's sort of there might be an uptick in productivity just by virtue of working from home that you might observe in the data. But maybe that's being confounded by the proxy you use because it's just less efficient, right? In other words, it ends up being endogenous as opposed to exogenous.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, like just a fantastic question. And this is something I toiled over for months as I was doing this research. Ultimately, what I landed on is that I was asking myself, the loss of productivity and the work-life balance, are they mutually exclusive concepts that are unrelated to one another? So you're bound by 24 hours in a day. And my argument was that if you're less efficient because you have to take, some of your work or your leisure time into your work time, some of your leisure time, you have to turn it into work time. The argument for work-life balance is that leisure over work ratio, and that's still being impacted, even if so we can look at it through the lens of productivity. We're less productive. Certainly, that's a problem, but we're still changing that ratio of work hours to leisure hours, and it's still kind of changing. I totally get it. The other thing that's aligned with your point is that maybe people want that. Why are we assuming that this is a bad thing? The argument can be made that if someone's working unpaid overtime hours, maybe they're doing so because they want to get favor with their boss, or dang, this is a really cool study on boats or something that they have to do. And then they're really, really interested in doing it in their free time. And I guess it's tough to make that call. And my other argument and my reply to that argument would be that, remember, we defined unpaid overtime hours as going uncompensated. And this is self-reported. So if people are saying, I'm working extra overtime hours that I'm not being paid a wage for, maybe I'm being compensated in favor to my boss. Maybe I'm being compensated in another way. I'm being put on the best file. But so all of that would essentially skew all of my estimates too high, and we would need to correct for the estimates, and we would interpret it in a different way. But that would be at least primarily that would be my reply to whether or not it's an endogeneity issue. Hopefully that answers your question sufficiently. Yeah. Okay. Excellent question.
Thanks, Jacob. I was wondering, kind of similar to that question, was could you potentially use another variable, or I know you're just using secondary data sources, but would there be another variable that might serve as a proxy for work-life balance? Or I guess my question is, could StatsCan measure that and create like a, ordinal scale and say like, hey, how's your work-life balance 1 to 5? And then you'd have it, and it would be a pretty quick question. So that's one question. And the other question is kind of related again to in those variables. Is there also income? And I'm curious if you looked into income and how your results vary with that.
Yeah. So Steve, two really good questions. The first one, I would love if StatsCan implemented a measure to directly research work-life balance. It would give a lot more specificity to my results, and I think that would be really nice. What I like about unpaid overtime hours, even if we don't, imply that it's a proxy or an instrument for work-life balance, is that it's still an interesting phenomenon. Like the fact that people are working and not being paid for it, that's still interesting to look at. Even if it's not necessarily work-life balance like we colloquially understand it, it's still kind of implementing that labor to leisure ratio, which ultimately, we're confined within the 24 hours, right? But sorry, a bit of a tangent. Absolutely something could be constructed, and absolutely if I were to do this study again with a data set that I would put my own survey out, I would love to research that, and it would make it better. It would be an absolute improvement. So just a fantastic point. The second one, you'll have to remind me of your question again. It was...
Yes, income.
Yes, income. Yes. So all of these takeaways here, so each of these results I controlled for work variables. So it's in my regression equation, I had a vector of controls. And that controlled the industry, the income level, whether or not they're unionized, whether or not, so a bunch of variables that were actually, I can tell you exactly what they are if you'd like. Which one? I've got 7. So yeah, work controls implement including NCAIS industry, union status, firm side, establishment side, category of worker, public, private, self-employed, and typical hours worked at current job. And then we also controlled for family composition, demographic controls, age, marital status, seasonality controls, and provincial controls, because not every province handled the pandemic the same way. So, yeah.
Great, thank you.
No problem. Again, great question.
By the way, it's a really beautiful LaTeX table. I love it. So another question is, so you talked about, so your data set is from 2019, 2020.
Yep.
And I was just out of curiosity. So if you end up doing this research with updated data set from 2021 surveys, and what kind of, I don't know, results, or would you anticipate, or what kind of considerations do you think could arise? For instance, we are having Omicron pandemic as opposed to Delta or the original COVID. So the situation's a little bit different, right?
Yeah.
So I was wondering, what do you think about?
Yeah, so fantastic question. If I could approach it and look and kind of draw out my results and try to see how much better I could make them if I included more recent data, I'd look at including a few different things. So the first one would be I'd try to include some sort of proxy for firm investment in work from home infrastructure. So some firms anticipated this to be over in half a year, 1 year, 2 years, some firms are like, all right, we're going for work from home. Here's your computer, here's your standing desk, here's your, I don't know, foot massager or whatever. The investing in infrastructure for people to work from home. So I'd love to analyze, and then I'd love to cross-section that with different industries. So did the legal industry invest more in work from home than economists or something like that? I'd love to take a look at, so if I could readdress my empirical approach for these different variants, and as it draws on, I'd like to introduce an interaction term for every different variant. And we could isolate specifically Delta, Omicron, and see how have these work from home kind of changes happened. Now that would be very tough to do because, like I said, this is monthly data. So it's not I couldn't do a perfect regression discontinuity at every time of implementation of a new variant. But that would be something that I would try to see. What do I anticipate to happen? I anticipate there to be exhaustion, lots of levels of exhaustion over the pandemic. And I don't know how that would manifest. I think it would manifest in kind of a return to the mean of work from home, work-life balance to pre-pandemic times. I think we'd see kind of a normalization of it. That's just my that's just my prediction.
So interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. James.
Yeah. So one last question that I think is kind of interesting, since it's not actual panel data that you're using. How are you controlling for the individual variation because it's quasi-panel?
So I have a fantastic question because we can't essentially control for individual effects. So what I do is I introduce, and you got your equation, good for you. So I've introduced all sorts of different industry fixed effects and regional fixed effects, and as many fixed effects as I could to kind of tease out any sort of fixed effects that I could. I'm not able to, we can address individual fixed effects. So we don't know how, one person from pre-COVID to post-COVID, like this certain individual A reacts, and we can't measure those individual effects, but we can measure, a female 40 to 49 makes 100K from Alberta, who has 2 kids, who has this, who has this, who has this, who has this, before and after the pandemic. We can measure that, but we can't get that individual level of granularity. So I'm not able to, but I'm trying my darndest, is what my answer is. Does that address?
Yeah, so if you're using that many controls in the model, how confident are you then that the F statistics that you derive, or whatever significant levels of significance that you derive, what's your confidence in their meaningfulness then?
So again, a really good question. I've introduced a ton of controls, but again, our sample is so huge. So even we're at 60 variables. I think with controls, I have 35 variables. Sample is just under 1 million after we include everybody who's not, or we disclude everybody that's not working. And it stays, so our the levels of statistical significance on the beta coefficients of each of these regressors stays at a very high confidence level. But that would be another issue that I have, is that I'm controlling so heavily, I'm over controlling, and I'm teasing out those effects. It's a genuine concern, so it's very valid.
Great.
Cool. Gabe?
Okay, so I don't know. I'm having a little bit of trouble teasing away the story. So you posed a number of great questions early on, and I was trying to get at this with understanding, okay, so what are we talking about? We're talking about unpaid overtime. So were you able to find, answer the questions that you set out to find? So does having parental responsibilities at home, does being a woman, does having a child really impact your ability to work from home? And what's the story there? So is it you're less efficient in a particular hour, so you end up working more because your attention is taking elsewhere? Can you help me tease out the story in that sense?
So I can provide the facts, but as any good economist, I'm not going to try. I'm going to try not to weave a narrative. I'm just going to try to present the results. So again, so being a parent has a small but positive effect on unpaid overtime hours worked during the pandemic. So parents who are at home with children are reporting that their work-life balance is diminishing during the pandemic now that they've had to work from home. And that's essentially that element of it. And if they're spending time away from their work to deal with, baby or teen or toddler or whoever, then they're seeing reductions in work-life balance. I don't know how those are manifested. It could be that now you have to teach your kid. You have to get them set up with an assignment. Now you have to cook them lunch instead of them getting lunch at school. Maybe you have to take them to dance recital instead of dance recital being at the school before. I'm not sure what the story is, and I don't know how that effect manifests.
Right.
The second one you had here was working from home during the pandemic had a negative effect on unpaid overtime hours reported for workers regardless of sex. So for individuals that could work from home, when the pandemic happened, they found increases in their work-life balance. That effect of everybody kind of being better, that effect was stronger in women. And that's...
Because that's a little bit counterintuitive, to what you would expect. So,
yeah. What you mean with this result about?
Or, no, like
Oh yes, this is
for
entirely like opposite of what I hypothesized. Yeah, this is, and I think this is important to illuminate because we think we know what we're talking about when it comes to work from home, but we really ought to understand because it's a very delicate balance as we move towards a remote work setting. Like we don't want to isolate, we don't want to discriminate against any type of worker, right? If our goal of working from home post-pandemic, like during the pandemic, it's to keep people alive. But post-pandemic, it's, are we going to see benefits? Well, it's important to completely understand it because as we understand, people who work from home, they don't get as many promotions. They're not, it's everything's really mixed and I leave a lot open to further research. But what I have presented is that there's some surprising results. Does that help?
thank you.
Okay.
Cool.
I think we should stop it because we're past 9. Thanks
Thanks.
again, Jacob.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.